On the night of February 5th, 2007, at 12:30 a.m., a middle-aged man named Hanke walked quietly down a deserted road toward a Chinese restaurant in the small town of Sittensen, Germany. This had been his nightly routine for years, as his wife worked at this restaurant, and every night he would personally come to pick her up after her exhausting shift. Before long, Hanke arrived at his destination, and the Chinese restaurant came into view. However, unlike previous nights, something felt wrong. The restaurant was eerily quiet, so silent that it made him uneasy. Even from outside the door, Hanke could sense a heavy, oppressive atmosphere hanging over the place. He knew this restaurant was extremely successful, with customers coming and going from morning until night, which was why they usually closed very late, sometimes well past midnight. But tonight, everything was shrouded in an unsettling silence. Hanke furrowed his brow as a sense of dread welled up inside him. He couldn't help but slow his pace, carefully approaching the restaurant step by step. When he reached the door, he knocked lightly, then harder, but there was no response from inside. Hanke stood there for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts, before finally deciding to push the door open. The moment the door swung open, a thick, pungent smell of blood hit him in the face, flooding his nostrils and nearly making him vomit. Then the scene before his eyes made Hanke's entire body tremble, chilled from head to toe. It was a sight that, even years later, would haunt him like a never-ending nightmare whenever it crossed his mind. The scene before him was one of utter chaos and tragedy. Tables and chairs were overturned everywhere, shattered glasses and cups scattered across the floor. Several bodies lay sprawled in various corners of the room, motionless in grotesque positions, and everywhere, from the floor to the walls, fresh red blood was splattered. Hanke quickly covered his mouth, trying to suppress the urge to vomit as he forced himself to move deeper into the restaurant. Among the overturned chairs and debris, he suddenly spotted his beloved wife lying motionless on the floor, her eyes half closed, her body long since cold. He rushed to her side, shaking her desperately, but she would never respond again. In that moment, Hanke's mind completely collapsed. He fled from the restaurant, stumbling and falling countless times on his way to the door. Once outside, with trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and called the police, his voice broken and choked with emotion. The dispatcher on the other end was equally stunned after hearing Hanke's account. Sittensen was just a small town. Never in its history had such a horrific crime occurred. Around 1 a.m., immediately after receiving the report, the Sittensen Police Department mobilized nearly its entire force. Over 80 police officers and medical personnel from surrounding units were urgently dispatched, flooding into the crime scene in the dead of night. Police cars and ambulances lined up one after another, their flashing lights tearing through the peaceful night of the town. Upon arrival, they quickly cordoned off the entire area, sealing off the crime scene for investigation. The Lin Yue restaurant was a well-built two-story villa, typical of the region's architecture, and the horrific massacre had mainly occurred on the first floor, where the dining area was located. When the police entered, the first person they saw was a young man lying face down near the main entrance. He was a 32-year-old Vietnamese sous chef. He had been shot from behind, with 6 bullet wounds through his body, blood pooling all over the floor. However, perhaps because the killer had fired in haste and missed vital organs, he was still barely breathing when police arrived, a faint glimmer of hope for survival. Medical personnel immediately administered first aid on the spot before rushing him to an ambulance, racing against time to get him to Rotenburg Hospital. Tragically, the following morning, due to excessive blood loss, he took his last breath at the hospital. The weapon used by the killers was a handgun. As police continued deeper into the restaurant, an even more horrific scene unfolded before them. Among the overturned chairs in the dining area, 3 bodies lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor. All 3 were face down, their hands bound tightly behind their backs with rope, their knees bent as if they had been kneeling. The most terrifying common factor was that all of them had been shot directly in the head. Looking at the positions of the bodies, the experienced investigators deduced that in those final moments, these people had knelt on the floor, begging their attackers for mercy. but it was all in vain, as the killers showed no compassion, not an ounce of mercy. The three unfortunate victims were a 39-year-old Malaysian waitress, a 38-year-old Vietnamese dishwasher, and a 56-year-old Chinese head chef. Not far down the hallway, police discovered another body. It was a young Thai waiter who had also been shot in the head. He had likely tried to escape in the chaos, but was spotted by the killers before he could reach the exit. Near the restaurant's cash register, police found two more bodies, a man and a woman. They were the restaurant owner Hong Fan and his wife Annie, the two people who had built this restaurant from nothing. However, amid that bloody scene, police made an unexpected discovery. Right beneath Annie's body, a small girl lay curled up, covered in blood. It was Tiana, the couple's 2-year-old daughter. Miraculously, she was completely unharmed. After the case was made public, many media outlets speculated about what happened in Annie's final moments. Perhaps when facing the killers, the young mother had knelt down to beg them to spare her baby daughter. In that desperate situation, she used her own body as a shield to protect her child. In the end, the killers probably realized that a 2-year-old couldn't pose any threat to them and decided to spare the girl. After all, even if Tiana had seen the killers' faces, a child that age couldn't provide any useful information to the police during the investigation. While searching the entire building, police made another unexpected discovery. In a room on the second floor, they found a young man sitting there with a dazed expression, seemingly unaware of what had happened. As it turned out, during the massacre on the first floor, he had been engrossed in playing computer games with headphones on. That's why he hadn't heard any noise or cries for help. The killers, for their part, had no idea he was upstairs, which allowed him to narrowly escape death. However, when police took his statement, the young man knew nothing. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything, and had no information that could help the investigation. The difficulties compounded when police discovered that there were no surveillance cameras installed around the restaurant. This meant there was no video evidence of the killers' faces or movements, making the case much harder to solve. So who were the killers? Why did they commit such a bloody and brutal massacre? During the autopsy, forensic experts carefully examined the victim's wounds and discovered an important clue. The bullet wounds were determined to have come from 2 different types of guns, indicating that there was more than one killer. Police concluded this was a gang crime, with at least 2 people directly involved in the massacre. When police interviewed residents living around the restaurant, they all confirmed that on the night of the crime, they hadn't heard any gunshots or cries for help. For an incident with 7 shooting victims, this silence was puzzling unless the killers had come well prepared. Based on this, police theorized that the perpetrators had likely used silencers to muffle the gunfire and avoid attracting attention. Upon examining the scene, police noticed that the cash in the register had been completely cleaned out. Additionally, 2 laptops and 13 old cell phones were missing. These signs indicated that the motive was robbery. However, what particularly caught the police's attention was the killer's use of firearms. In Germany, gun control is extremely strict. Even some police officers don't carry weapons, and ordinary citizens would have an even harder time obtaining them. Yet these perpetrators not only had guns, but at least 2 of different types, plus silencers. This indicated they weren't ordinary amateur thieves. Based on this analysis, police suspected the killers must have come from an organization with considerable capability and scale, able to obtain weapons and plan such a large-scale robbery. Their first suspects were organized crime groups operating in the area. Among them, the Triads and Vietnamese gangs were the most suspicious, as both organizations had branches operating in nearby Hamburg at the time. According to a report by Die Welt, one of Germany's largest newspapers during the 1990s, Hamburg was plagued by organized crime groups, particularly the Triads. During that period, over 90% of Chinese restaurants in Hamburg were forced to pay high protection money to the Triads. Some restaurant owners had tried to resist and refuse payment, but they were met with violent retaliation. Even death threats were common. And it wasn't just Chinese restaurants. Turkish and Italian food businesses had similar experiences. Although the situation had significantly improved after entering the 21st century, collecting protection money remained a tradition for organized crime groups. It was a highly profitable revenue source that didn't require much effort, so they wouldn't give it up easily. With the Lin Yue restaurant doing such booming business, it might well have caught the triad's attention. Police theorized that perhaps the Hong fan couple had refused to pay protection money, and this massacre was the gang's retaliation. However, after thorough investigation, police found this possibility to be quite small. There were two main reasons for this conclusion. First, as a large gang with extensive influence, the protection money the triads collected from restaurants was typically very high, at least 6 figures. Meanwhile, the total value of stolen property from the Lin Yue restaurant was just some cash from the register, 2 laptops, and 13 old phones, a sum far too small and completely disproportionate. If the triads had really been targeting the Hong fan couple for money, they could have gotten much more through kidnapping for ransom. Killing a wealthy restaurant owner family would be like cutting off their own financial pipeline. Furthermore, the triads were known for working carefully, never leaving evidence that could get them in trouble with the law. Rather than directly demanding protection money from merchants, they typically used more sophisticated tactics, such as forcing restaurant owners to buy goods at inflated prices from their designated sources. This way, even if police investigated, their behavior would only be considered forced sales rather than extortion or theft. An experienced organization like the Triads wouldn't risk causing such a sensational murder case over such a small amount of money. Second, forensic results showed that the victim's time of death was around midnight. Notably, 2 of them had managed to make phone calls for help before dying, though the calls were quickly cut off. Additionally, the sous chef was found near the restaurant's entrance with 6 bullet wounds. This indicated he had tried to escape and was repeatedly shot from behind by the killers. These details proved that the killers had failed to completely control everyone in the restaurant from the start, allowing victims opportunities to call for help and run. This was a very important point, because when organized crime groups strike, they typically plan meticulously and execute professionally and cleanly. They would quickly control the entire scene, not allowing anyone a chance to resist or call for help. The chaos and lack of control in this case didn't match the operating style of professional criminal organizations. Based on this, suspicions about Vietnamese gangs were also temporarily ruled out. But if it wasn't the organized gangs, then who were the killers? Had this restaurant somehow offended someone and provoked revenge? To answer this question, we need to learn about the background of the restaurant owners. Hong Fan was born in 1971 in Hong Kong, China. As a child, he immigrated to England with his family. At 26, with dreams of independence and building his own career, he decided to go to Germany alone to start a business. It was there that he met and got to know Annie, a young woman 8 years his junior. Both were ethnic Chinese holding British passports, sharing much in common culturally and in their circumstances. They quickly hit it off, fell in love at first sight, and soon decided to get married. The Hong Fan couple lived happily together, their relationship always strong. Together they opened a Chinese restaurant and named it Lin Yue. This was the first Chinese restaurant in the small town of Sittensen, with an elegantly decorated space and absolutely delicious food. Thanks to this, the restaurant quickly attracted a large customer base and business flourished. Over years of running the business, the Hong Fan couple had accumulated considerable wealth. They bought a luxury BMW and purchased the 2-story villa they had been renting. This was a typical 2-story building with an attic common to the region, where the first floor served as the restaurant and the second floor was the family's living quarters. Every day, the Hong Fan couple and some staff worked in the restaurant downstairs, then retired upstairs in the evening to rest. When Hong Fan was 34, the couple welcomed their first child. About a month before the incident, Hong Fan's mother moved from Hanover to the small town of Sittensen, living near her son's restaurant. When the couple was busy with business, she would help look after her granddaughter. Just days before the tragedy occurred, the family had held a warm birthday party to celebrate their daughter Tiana turning 2. Some townspeople had even come to attend and offer congratulations. When asked about the Hong Fan family, they all said the restaurant owners were very kind and likable. The whole family was friendly and warm to their neighbors. Being ethnic Chinese living in Europe themselves, the Hong fan couple had particularly deep affection for other Chinese living in Germany, and more broadly for the Asian community in general. They were always willing to help fellow countrymen facing difficulties in a foreign land. All the staff working at their restaurant were Asian. The Hong fan couple treated their employees very well, like family. By all accounts, the Hong fan couple had always treated everyone around them well. They shouldn't have made enemies or grudges with anyone, but life can be absurdly ironic sometimes. Excessive kindness can inadvertently bring disaster upon oneself. About 6 months before the incident, a middle-aged Vietnamese man came to the restaurant looking for work. He had just arrived in Germany not long before, didn't know anyone, and was struggling to get by. Seeing the unfortunate circumstances of a fellow Asian, Hong Fan didn't hesitate to warmly offer him a job at the restaurant. During his time working there, this man had a habit that caught people's attention. He always liked wandering around every corner of the restaurant, observing everything. Hong Fan noticed this, but simply thought he was new and curious about the work environment, so he didn't pay it any mind or grow suspicious. But then one day, the man suddenly left the restaurant without a word, and from then on, disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went. Police suspected that during his time at the restaurant, this man may have deliberately gathered information about the restaurant for nefarious purposes later. This was further supported when police discovered an important detail. Before the incident, Hong Fan had confided to a close friend that about 6 months earlier, an employee had told him he had underworld backing. This statement made Hong Fan feel uneasy, worried about his and his family's safety. Because of this, he had been planning to sell the restaurant for 200,000 euros to distance himself from trouble. As for Annie, she had already applied for a job at a shoe store in Hamburg, preparing for a new life after leaving the restaurant. But everything happened too fast. Just days after Hong Fan shared these concerns with his friend, the horrific massacre occurred at the Lin Yue restaurant. So what role did this mysterious Vietnamese man actually play in this case? Let's start with a suspicious pair of brothers. In fact, the very next day after the crime, police had already found their first 2 suspects. The Lin Yue restaurant was located not far from German Federal Highway 1. The senior police officer in charge of the investigation believed that after committing the crime, the killers would most likely choose this route to escape, so he ordered his forces to conduct checks along the highway. On the afternoon of February 5th at 1:10 p.m. at a rest stop on the highway, police spotted 2 suspicious men. They were driving a blue Volkswagen Polo through the stop and were pulled over for a routine check. What caught the officer's attention was that both men looked extremely nervous, their faces pale, and when asked to produce identification, they stammered and couldn't provide any. The officer immediately sensed something was wrong and asked both men to step out of the vehicle for a more thorough inspection. While getting out, one of them secretly crumpled up a piece of paper and quickly tossed it under the car, thinking his action was discreet enough to go unnoticed. But he was wrong. The sharp-eyed officer had seen everything. The paper was picked up and opened, and its contents startled the police. Written on it was the location of the Lin Yue restaurant along with a fairly detailed hand-drawn floor plan of the restaurant's interior. Police immediately took both men to the station for questioning. Initial verification showed they were Vietnamese brothers, one 34 years old and the other 31, both residing in the city of Bremen. They had no official employment in Germany, and the Volkswagen Polo they were driving was a rental. Since their exact names couldn't be confirmed, investigators commonly referred to them as the Van brothers during the investigation. When faced with interrogation, both brothers adamantly denied any involvement in the Lin Yue restaurant case. They claimed that on the night of the massacre, they had both been gambling at a casino near Bremen. To prove their alibi, one of them even produced a time-stamped entry ticket from the casino, and the time on it coincided with the time of the crime. This meant that at least one of the brothers had a fairly solid alibi for when the murders occurred. Although police knew these 2 men were highly suspicious, just a paper with a restaurant floor plan wasn't enough evidence to charge them. Under German law, when the permitted interrogation time expires without sufficient evidence, the police must release the suspects. The Van brothers were temporarily freed, leaving the investigators extremely frustrated. But just when the case seemed to have hit a dead end, a DNA test report arrived and completely exposed the Van brothers' lies. In fact, immediately after bringing the two men to the station, police had conducted a thorough search of all their personal belongings and clothing. On the younger brother's shoe heel, they found a small remaining bloodstain. This blood sample was sent for testing, and the results showed it was a complete DNA match with one of the victims at the restaurant. Moreover, additional bloodstains and fabric fibers originating from the crime scene were found on both brothers' clothing. This irrefutable physical evidence was enough to prove that they were the ones who had directly participated in that horrific massacre. Faced with undeniable evidence, the Van brothers finally had to confess to the crimes they had committed. During their confession, they also revealed 3 additional accomplices, all of Vietnamese origin. In reality, from the day of the crime until all 5 suspects were identified, German police spent about 6 months of intensive investigation. Throughout the process, they examined over 3,000 items and collected and analyzed nearly 400 different leads. The important evidence police gathered included 3 handguns the killers had used in the massacre, along with 2 laptops and 13 cell phones that had gone missing from the restaurant on the night of the crime. The mastermind behind the entire case was a Vietnamese man surnamed Quach, 42 years old, the same middle-aged man who had come to the restaurant looking for work and worked there temporarily, as we mentioned earlier. It turned out that from the very beginning of his employment at the restaurant, he had developed greed upon witnessing the thriving business and comfortable life of the Hong Fan couple. Although he hadn't worked there long, he had used the opportunity to observe and memorize everything, from the daily business operations to the layout of the rooms to the opening and closing hours. That's exactly why he had wandered around everywhere during his time there. After abruptly quitting and disappearing, he had harbored evil intentions, waiting for the right moment to strike. About a month before the crime, Quach happened to meet the Van brothers while drinking at a bar. Meeting fellow Vietnamese speakers in a foreign land, the 3 quickly felt a sense of kinship and closeness. Moreover, their circumstances were very similar. All of them were unemployed, broke, and scraping by in a foreign country. During their conversations, Quach proposed that they commit a robbery together to get money, and his target was the restaurant where he had once worked and knew inside out. The Van brothers thought the plan seemed feasible, and being hard up for cash, they agreed to participate. Quach took on the role of behind-the-scenes planner, drawing detailed floor plans of the restaurant and devising a specific robbery plan. The Van brothers would be the ones to carry it out directly. To be more certain about the job, before taking action they recruited 2 more Vietnamese men. One was named Pham Hai Pho, 30 years old. The other was surnamed Vu, 40 years old. Thus, a criminal gang of 5 was formed, ready for the fateful robbery. On the evening of February 4th at 11:30 p.m., the robbery plan began. Except for Quach, who stayed behind to direct from afar, the other 4 all participated directly. They drove the blue Volkswagen Polo to the Lin Yue restaurant, ready to make their move. A few minutes later, the restaurant began closing up, ending its day of business. At this point, nearly all the staff had gathered in the main hall, resting and finishing up the day's final tasks before going home. According to plan, Vu was assigned to stand guard outside, watching for any movement around the area. The Van brothers and Pham Hai Pho put on black ski masks to cover their faces, then burst into the restaurant with guns drawn. They pointed their weapons at everyone and threatened them to keep quiet. Faced with this sudden and terrifying situation, everyone in the restaurant was so scared they stood frozen in place, not daring to move. Just then, one female victim was on the phone with an old classmate. Her phone was snatched from her hand by one of the robbers, and she screamed in fear. At a signal from the older Van brother, Pham Hai Pho left the main hall and went upstairs, heading to the owner's living quarters to search for cash. The number of robbers on the first floor was now reduced to 2. At this point, the Vietnamese waitress noticed she was standing near the restaurant's back door. Seeing the number of guards decrease, she decided not to sit and wait for death. Seizing the moment, she immediately ran toward the back door, trying to escape the scene. But she didn't realize that the Van brothers knew the entire layout of the restaurant thanks to the floor plan provided by Quash, and they had anticipated that someone might try to escape this way. Before entering, they had already locked the back door shut with a chain. When she reached the door, it wouldn't open. Her only escape route was blocked. In desperation, she managed to pull out her phone to call for help. Her first call was to her husband, but he was taking a shower and didn't answer. Not giving up, she hurriedly called a relative in Malaysia. The call connected, but only 19 seconds later, the killers found her and caught her. At this point, the Van brothers just wanted to take the money and leave. They hadn't originally intended to kill anyone. After catching the waitress, they slapped her and brought her back to the main hall with the others. To prevent further incidents and maintain control, they took out electrical cable they had prepared in advance and began tying everyone's hands. However, when it came time to tie up the sous chef, he refused to accept his fate. He struggled violently, resisting fiercely and scuffling with the younger Van brother. During the struggle, he suddenly managed to pull off the robber's black ski mask, fully exposing his face. The moment his face was seen, the younger Van knew that if this person survived, he would be identified. The thought of killing to silence witnesses immediately sprang to his mind, and he raised his gun and aimed at the sous chef. In that moment, he was still hesitating, undecided. But the sous chef was now so terrified he could barely think. His survival instinct drove him to immediately turn and run desperately toward the restaurant's front door. This sudden attempt to flee startled the younger Van, and reflexively he squeezed the trigger repeatedly, firing 6 consecutive shots at the fleeing sous chef and dropping him near the entrance. Actually, at this point, the sous chef was still barely breathing, but the 2 killers at the scene, seeing him lying motionless in a pool of blood, reflexively assumed he was dead and didn't fire any more shots. Just then, Pham Hai Pho returned to the main hall after searching upstairs. Seeing the scene before them, all 3 realized the situation had spiraled out of control. Since they had already started killing, they might as well finish the job and silence all witnesses. And so a bloody massacre began. The Thai waiter saw the dire situation and tried to run, but before he could get far, a bullet went straight into his head. Witnessing this brutal scene, the Malaysian waitress, the Vietnamese dishwasher, and the Chinese head chef were terrified beyond measure and dropped to their knees one by one, begging for their lives. But at this point, the 3 killers had lost all conscience. They coldly walked up behind each person and shot them. The Hong Fan couple witnessed this horrific scene and knew they probably couldn't escape. But thinking of their 2-year-old baby daughter, they decided to risk everything. Both of them charged at the robbers, trying one last time to resist and protect their child. But flesh and blood are no match for guns and bullets. The couple each took 2 bullets and fell into pools of blood. Annie, before taking her final breath, still held her daughter tightly in her arms, using her last remaining strength to beg the killers to spare the innocent child. Perhaps thinking that a 2-year-old couldn't understand anything, they left the baby alone. Thanks to this, amid that terrifying night, Tiana miraculously survived. Afterward, the killers grabbed everything of value they could carry, including cash from the register, 2 laptops, and 13 cell phones, then quickly fled the scene. As mentioned earlier, there was actually a young man in a room on the 2nd floor who had been playing games with headphones on. Since neither party knew of the other's existence, he had narrowly escaped the massacre. Police initially suspected this young man might be involved, but after thorough investigation confirmed he was completely innocent. In May 2009, more than 2 years after the massacre, the Linway restaurant case officially went to trial in a German court. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the court issued its final verdict. The 3 killers who had directly stormed the restaurant to commit robbery and murder, the Van brothers and Pham Hai Pho, were sentenced to life imprisonment for intentional homicide, with no possibility of parole. Since Germany doesn't have the death penalty, this was the most severe punishment under the law. Vu, who had only stood guard outside and didn't directly participate in the robbery and murder, was sentenced to 14 years in prison. As for Quach, although he was the mastermind who planned the entire crime, the court's reasoning was that when making the original plan, he had no intention of killing anyone, and the deaths of the 7 victims occurred unexpectedly and weren't directly connected to him. Therefore, he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. With the killers convicted and serving their sentences, the Lin Yue restaurant massacre case was finally officially closed. Looking back at the entire incident, just for 8,500 euros, about $9,200, in cash, 13 old cell phones and 2 laptops, 5 killers had brutally taken the lives of 7 innocent people. This was truly an act of cruelty and evil beyond imagination. Because this case was so bloody and brutal, even though many years have passed, it's still frequently mentioned as one of the most horrific massacres ever to occur in Germany. And the small town of Sittensen, once a peaceful place, now carries a scar that may never fully heal. And that's today's case. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.